Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It is 3 o'clock. I know we have an exciting webinar planned for you, so I want to get started on time. I see our panelist, Tim Wales, is with us. Welcome to today's webinar, the CDRPC Local Government Workshop Webinar, AWIA, Risk, Resilience, and Emergency Plan Requirements for Your Community. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. My name is Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs for the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. Quite a mouthful, so we just refer to ourselves as CDRPC. We are a regional planning and resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties, and we foster intergovernmental cooperation, communicating, collaborating, and facilitating regional initiatives. We work with partners to help them address regional problems. We established this webinar series to help planners sharpen their skills and as a vehicle for Planning and Zoning Board of Appeals members to obtain credit hours. Housekeeping notes, our attendees join with video and audio off for security purposes. This does not mean that you're unable to ask questions, however, and participate actively in the webinar. We actually encourage that you do so. There is the chat function, either using chat or the Q&A to interact with us. We highly recommend that you do that and encourage you to do so. Use those functions and I'll function sort of like a radio DJ. And when you put a question into the chat function, I'll periodically interject into our presenter and make sure we get to those questions as we move forward. We will be archiving the presentations as PDF, and then we are also recording this webinar, and the links to those materials will be on the Eventbrite website from which you use to register for this webinar series. So they will be posted once we're done processing the video. After each webinar in the series, each attendee that registered with an email address will receive an email confirming their attendance, and this email may be submitted to your municipality for consideration of credit. The email is sent in lieu of a certificate. So the email is proof that you attended the series, and that email will have a link back to the website for opportunities to sign up for additional webinars and certainly access to a recording of this webinar so you can access the archive. City, town, and village and county planning board of appeals members and planning board members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training a year. Municipalities do have a wide latitude in determining what training is acceptable for credit, and we believe proof of attendance for this webinar will meet your community's needs. However, if there are questions or concerns from your municipality about this event, please have them contact CDRPC and we can work to get them proof of attendance that will meet their needs. In addition, for practicing AICP certified planners, we've submitted this session for 1 hour of CM to the APA. So let's get into today's session. America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018, AWIA, amends the Safe Drinking Water Act and includes new resilience planning and emergency response plan requirements for drinking water utilities. Community water systems serving populations of more than 3,300 are required to complete risk and resilience assessments and emergency response plans to certify the completion of these documents to EPA. The new assessment not only includes consideration of malicious acts, but also serves to review a risk of all types of emergency situations and to conduct planning for water systems to become as resilient as possible in order to maintain continuity of operations. Plans are intended to ensure the provision of safe and reliable source and supply of public drinking water during difficult times. Certification of risk and resilience assessments for water systems serving from 3,301 to 49,999 people are due by June 30th, 2021, and certification of emergency response plans are due by December 31st, 2021. Certifications of risk and resiliency plans and emergency response plans for larger water utilities are due this year. Planning for these assessments should begin at least 6 to 12 months in advance, as these can require significant efforts for data gathering, analysis, and completion of these assessment reports. We are joined here today by Tim Wales, an engineer and chief water resources engineer with the MRB Group, who will guide us through this process and offer his perspective and insight. I do want to thank the MRB Group for their underwriting and support of this webinar. Their sponsorship helps keep the cost of this webinar series affordable to our attendees. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tim and welcome him to the webinar series and thank him for his time presenting to us today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Martin. Just gonna get my presentation up. All right, great. So yeah, a lot of things there in the intro. We'll try and break those down a little bit, talk about AWIA. I'm Tim Wales. I am the Chief Water Resources Engineer for MRB Group, which is a private consulting engineer. I spent the last almost 9 years as city engineer for the city of Saratoga Springs. So I have a lot of experience in both the private and the public side. So get a little bit of feel for the way municipalities look at things and as well as the private side values. So we're going to talk about AWIA today. So I'm going to get right into my presentation. America's Water Infrastructure Act. On October 23rd, 2018, AWIA was signed into law. The law requires applicable drinking water utilities to conduct risk assessments and update emergency response plans. The law includes components that the risk assessments and the ERPs must address and establishes deadlines by which water systems must certify to EPA completion of these risk assessment and emergency response plans. So we're going to discuss that a little bit today. It is a federal requirement that provides for water infrastructure improvements throughout the United States. It does replace the Safe Drinking Water Act, Section 1433, which is the 2002 Bioterrorism Act. Many of you may remember that in 2002, the EPA promulgated regulations called the Bioterrorism Act. And as part of that, they required vulnerability assessments at municipal facilities like community water systems, water plants, things like that, to make an assessment of vulnerability of your water systems to terrorist attacks. Obviously, being able to provide safe drinking water by municipalities, water systems, and utilities, very important part of the work they do. And they are susceptible, unfortunately, to malicious acts and terrorism acts, things like that. So that regulation in 2002 was formed around the terrorist attacks, where the new regulations talk a little bit about all types of emergencies, not only malicious acts, weather events, and other events that can impact operations and the utilities' ability to maintain continuity of operations and supply potable water to its citizens. So this applies to community water systems, if you will, water utilities serving more than 3,300 people. So, which is most of the utilities around here. There are many small towns that are under 3,300, but this applies to everyone 3,300 people and above. So. Alrighty, so just an overview of the applicable AWIA sections. AWIA is a very big regulation, but we're drilling down to what applies to community water systems. Again, I mentioned it's over 3,300 people. It requires these utilities to conduct a risk and resilience assessment and to update the emergency response plans. And as mentioned, you have to certify that to EPA by specified deadlines. In the past, with the old vulnerability assessments, the EPA actually wanted to receive that document and you had to submit those. That's not required here. The EPA just wants municipalities to complete the plans and then certify that they have completed them.
Hey, Tim, if you're, just wanted to interject for a moment. If you intended to share your PowerPoint at this point in time, maybe I'm jumping early, but we don't see your screen if you are intending. Just as
I thought I shared that. Hang on here. Let me get right out of this. Okay, share screen.
And if you're working off two monitors, sometimes you got to be careful to share the right screen.
Yeah, no, I do have this one. Okay, let's go. Let's go that one. Okay, I have that one highlighted, and oh, maybe I didn't hit share. I'm sorry.
There we go. Success.
All right, I apologize. All right, well, you got to hear me talk with a lot of backup. Okay, so you see the slide?
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. All right, so I just covered the overview about the EPA and the deadlines, and we're going to discuss the resources and techniques to assist with compliance today. So, glad you said so. All right, so some of the additional requirements of AWIA, they require review, update, and revisions as necessary to submit a recertification of both plans every 5 years thereafter. So once you do your initial plans, you have to make sure they're up to date and recertify them every 5 years. As you can imagine, risk and resilience assessments, as well as emergency response plans, are a dynamic document. They should certainly be evolving as things change with utilities, especially with emergency response and things like that. So they also require coordination with local emergency planning committees. There are emergency planning committees on the state, the local, the county, on the federal level. I know here in Saratoga County, we have quite an active county emergency planning group. So municipalities here would be coordinating certainly with the county emergency planning office, not others. They also require maintenance of records of the risk and resilience assessment and the emergency response plan for at least 5 years after certification submittal. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the risk and resilience assessment. This is basically an evaluation of the risk to the system from malevolent acts and natural hazards. Things to evaluate include the resilience of pipes, constructed conveyances, source water, water collection intake structures, pretreatment, treatment plants, storage and distribution facilities, also electronic, computer, and other automated systems, including security and cybersecurity of those systems. You need to evaluate the monitoring practices of the system. In other words, how you detect malevolent threats or other things. So the financial infrastructure of the system, which we'll talk a little bit about, it's very important to review that. Certainly chemical use, storage and handling is something that's very prone to malevolent acts or other emergencies. And operation and maintenance procedures and how they impact the maintenance and security of your systems. It may also include review of capital and operational needs for risk management. Sometimes you're going to make a plan that may have additional security measures, cameras, fencing, alarm systems, those kind of things, and or improvements to your operational systems, and those will need capital budget amendments or costs. So you may need to review the capital program for this and plan costs for future needs. Review of water models and as-built mapping. Water models, we'll talk a little bit about going forward here, how they can benefit you in your risk and resiliency planning. And we'll give some examples. Review of asset management plans and inventories. Many municipalities have as-built mapping. They have asset management plans in place. There's inventories of assets that many municipalities have. All these can be beneficial. GASB 34 inventories, some municipalities have. GASB 34 is a government accounting standards board. And that's a government required accounting of the value of public infrastructure that was required as roads, bridges, facilities, pumping stations, tanks, plus the operation and maintenance costs are those. Those are required of certain municipalities. And if that inventory is there of all those facilities and a value, that can be very beneficial in creating your risk and resilience assessments. Well, as I mentioned, financial risk analysis is very important to the risk and resiliency assessments. This involves an evaluation of the continuity of operations for attacks that threaten fiscal operations. In other words, if your municipality was attacked by ransomware or a cyber attack of some sort, how are you going to be able to collect data and provide billing? If you can't bill for extended periods of time, how are you going to generate revenue? How are you going to collect data and use that data for operations purposes? So the financial analysis is an important part of this, and how prepared are you for an emergency that impacts your monetary streams, things like that, as well as cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is very important. You hear a lot of things about that. Some municipalities get attacked by ransomware. If your entire computer system is shut down, either a ransomware attack or some other kind of malicious attack, like I said, things like billing, collection of revenue, water reports, all those things, you can't do those things, and they can affect your continuity of operations. And as you know, many people rely on their potable water and take it for granted. If you can no longer account for that or do that or maintain your operational systems, that can be a problem. So So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the steps in a risk and resilience plans. Again, you'll get a PDF of this, and the AWIA and all these programs are very complex, a lot of components to them. So I'll just go through, kind of provide an overview of some of the steps that municipalities need to take with risk and resilience assessments. It's by no means a complete analysis here, but these are kind of the basic components of what goes into a risk and resilience assessment. So there are 5 main components that we'll go over here. The first is a characterization of your utility assets. In other words, you want to know what you've got. We talked a little bit before about inventories and things like that. So you need to define your critical functions of your water utility. You need to determine critical assets that, if they are lost or impaired, could have major impacts on your continuity of operations. You need to determine what your existing security mechanisms are, your protection for your reservoirs. Is there fencing? Is there access? Are there cameras? How do you detect malicious acts, or how do you monitor these things, whether it's fencing or building security, locks and things like that, those kind of things. So you provide, then when you get all that data, you have a ranking or prioritization of critical assets. You rank the highest, give the highest score to things that, if they went down, you'd be in real trouble on down the line, to things that are not as high priority. And you have a pump station. Well, you have redundant pumps there. You have 2 pumps. So if one of the pumps goes down, you still have that second pump to fill your water tank or provide pressure in the system. And so that would get a lower score because there's some redundancy there. Next step is to characterize your security threats. You want to define the malevolent threats that could occur. If you have a reservoir that's next to a main road, or easily accessible without fencing, things like that, that's a pretty high security threat. Identify natural hazards, depending on where you are. If you're a coastal utility, you have obviously significant hurricanes and storms, flooding, tornadoes, other hazards you can identify. Identify internal accident hazards, spills, chemical spills, things like that. One of the things here in Saratoga, we have some of the considerable amount of oil that runs through here in tanker cars from the oil sands and oil shales around. Well, they run through the nearby tracks, and we could have a major spill, major disaster. That spill that could impact our surface water reservoir here. And those are some of the other things. And then once again, you provide a ranking of these threats to the assets. Right? And then what you end up doing is making a threat asset pair. Okay, and there'll be a big matrix kind of provided, and each of those threat asset pairs will be listed, and we'll evaluate each one of those. So the next step is a consequence analysis.
If I could, this is Martin. Here, let me go to my camera. That's easier. A question about some of the threats and how they work into that matrix and vulnerability. Some of the threats you were talking about seem like acute threats, a spill, a malicious event, or an immediate emergency that may affect the water supply. Does the resiliency or the vulnerability assessment take in consideration some chronic threats to a water body? For example, a growth in perhaps nutrient loading, or land uses that contribute to water quality degradation from either warming up the tributaries that feed the resource, or a kind of over time impairment of the water body. Is that something that this assessment gets into?
Oh, definitely. You want to evaluate any kind of threat that could impact either your ability to supply potable water. If you have a watershed or a surface water body and a lot of development pressure there, and there's no rules and regulations for watershed management, or maybe you have a surface water body that you allow boating on. Well, what happens there? If you're allowing boating, you could have an acute threat, or over time, a lot of runoff, a lot of development. One of the things that happens, we saw in Saratoga Springs, our turbidity levels would go up in the surface water, goes from development drainage. So definitely those kind of things are longer term impacts, but all those things go into a risk and resilience assessment. And again, these would be dynamic assessments. They're not a static thing.
Right.
They'll, improve over time. And as time goes on, those threats may become higher and higher. But to answer your question, yes, not only acute threats, but long-term threats should be evaluated.
So I think kind of the take home here for our planning and zoning board members is to be aware of these vulnerability assessments or resiliency assessments, because ultimately the land use decisions that the municipality is making when they're in the watershed of a drinking water supply, even if that drinking water supply isn't owned by the municipality or it's the boundaries of that municipality, they need to be thinking about the long-term impacts of development on water supplies.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Here at the Loveberry Lake Reservoir in Saratoga Springs, the city had completed the watershed rules and regulations, which governed development, use and access of the lake. And although there are private property around the lake, it was enacted and approved by the Department of Health that said, you can't put a boat on a lake, can't put a dock, and there's limited things you can do around the lake, and also as well as development land use regulations were around that. So people would propose a development in some similar area. The part of the planning board review process would also be to review the rules and regulations of the watershed and make sure that development is in compliance with that. Another example, Village of Cooperstown. The Otsego Lakes, there's a Village of Cooperstown as their sole main water supply. And what they did is several years back, they authored and got approved the watershed rules and regulations. And what they did, there was approximately 380 camps around the lake, and they gave themselves the authority to go around and inspect the wastewater treatment system at every camp. And every camp was part of an inspection test, and if they failed, and about 50% of them they were required within a certain period to update that to an acceptable wastewater treatment system. And they did that to protect the water quality and the water supply for the village. So those are kind of things you think about when you look at resilience and risk assessment. So
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I hope I answered the question. All right. Okay, so we've characterized our assets and our threats, and we've come up with threat asset pairs. Next thing we're going to do is look at our consequences. Okay, identify the consequence of significant events. All right. One thing I use as an example for the city water treatment plant, there's never emergency power there at the water plant. Well, what did that mean? That meant the water treatment plant would have to keep the water tank, 5 million gallon water tank, full. Okay, because if they were able to raise and lower the water in that tank and there was a power outage or something where power was lost for several days, they wouldn't be able to fill the tank and they wouldn't have very long a water supply for the city. So they had to keep it right at 5 million gallons. What happens then is you get stratification of chlorine. It's hard to maintain residual chlorine and things like that. By raising and being able to have the flexibility to raise and lower the water in the tank, they knew that if there was an emergency, they could still fill the tank because they had emergency power. So the consequence of a power outage there was dire. If they had low water in the tank and they had a power outage, that was a pretty significant consequence within a relatively short period of time, a matter of hours. They were no longer able to supply water from the elevated storage tank. So those are the kind of things you look at in the consequence analysis. What happens when we have a flood? We have a pump station, it's near a river. Okay, if that is below flood stage, we get a big flood there in the spring, we get a big storm, we're going to lose that pump station. What happens to that pump station? That booster station, we're no longer going to be able to supply water under pressure to this particular subdivision. Those are kind of things. So you develop worst case scenarios. Again, I mentioned, a railway accident. We have a major oil spill into the surface reservoir. Well, pretty big consequence there. We can no longer use that reservoir until that is cleaned up. One gallon of oil will contaminate 1 million gallons of water. You develop a consequence ranking for that as well. So you can see we're going to have these classifications and we're going to develop rankings for these. And these will all play a role in a minute. And the next step is a vulnerability analysis. And then we want to identify the vulnerable assets, equipment, piping, processes. We have a pump station with only one pump in it. So that pump goes down, we're in trouble. Facility plans, as-built drawings, all these internal processes are standard operating procedures, okay? We have an old facility that if we have an earthquake, it's a masonry block, already has cracks, we could lose that facility and its ability to function. We'll conduct inspections to verify preliminary determinations to assess vulnerability. Obviously, you're going to want to inspect your structures, your reservoirs, your pumping stations, parts of the distribution system, things like that. And once again, we're going to provide a ranking of vulnerability. We're going to look at our most vulnerable assets, a high value, and our least vulnerable assets, a low value. In other words, we have newly constructed booster stations, we have newly installed pumps. They're redundant. We have 2 pumps. If one goes down, those things have low vulnerability. Alrighty, so then we're going to do a threat analysis. Lastly, we're going to the likelihood of event occurring. Well, what's the likelihood of us getting a 100-year storm, which is interesting because all the hydrologic charts are being rewritten now. And a 100-year storm now seems to happen much more frequently. This is where in hydrology, statistical probability of natural events come in. You need to calculate the statistical probability of the events occurring and assess the likelihood of them occurring. And people think about, wow, 1,000-year storms, 10,000-year storms, things like that. Well, it's never going to happen. Well, a couple of years back, remember the city of Houston got 52 inches of rain in one storm, and that was a 10,000-year event. But with a lot more energy in the upper atmosphere, climate change, things like that, the hydrologic charts are all getting rewritten, and these things are being reassessed. We analyze the dependency hazards, okay, and ranking of these threats to assets. Once again, so you're going to come up with these rankings for each of these 3 categories: the consequence, vulnerability, and the threat. And we're going to calculate our risk. So our risk equals the consequence times the vulnerability times the threat. So threat analysis is rated per year. All right, so, and our risk is related in dollars. So, our consequence is rated in dollars. So our risk is going to come out at dollars per year. And we're going to be able to put a dollar value on our risk for evaluation of all these threat asset pairs. And then we're going to calculate the resilience level for our water system. And it sounds kind of complex. It's difficult just to give it a kind of overview now. It does sound in depth, but there's a method to that madness. And what you come out with is, like I said, a resilience level for your entire system, and then you can make decisions on that. It gives you the dollars per year that you need to spend to address all these systems to lower your risk. And then the decision comes into, well, how much money do we have available? How much do we want to spend on this? And where is that cutoff where it is worth it to allocate capital funds versus, well, we're going to push that down the road. It's very low consequence of failure, very low likelihood of failure, and we can push some of those things out. So basically the risk and resilience management now comes into play, as I talked about. We're going to think about the management of risk and resilience. We're going to see where our acceptable level of scores are. In other words, some things that score very high are going to need immediate funding, immediately addressed in our capital plans. Identify options for security, process training to head off, mitigate significant events. We want to develop estimated costs for mitigation measures. All right, and we're going to calculate our benefits versus cost ratios for measures. And that's a very subjective thing. Okay, what is the benefit versus how much we're going to cost? We don't want to spend a couple $1 million on some improvements here, but get very little benefit from this. So those ratios are very important. And then once we get all that figured out, we're going to prioritize our measures through capital funding. Or if we want to develop better standard operating procedures and operational upgrades, it's important to get management commitment on this, mission statements, those kind of things. And again, it's an evolving program. You can't do everything all at once. All righty, so these are just some of the resources, and again, this will be the PDF. The good news is there are a lot of resources to help communities, municipalities, utilities with this. The EPA's website for risk and resilience is epa.gov/water resilience. And there's just a wealth of information on there. It's a great website, all kinds of guidance documents, how-tos. There's a self-assessment tool for vulnerability assessments. So I know it probably sounds scary. Municipalities have to do all this, but there's some great guidance out there. The vulnerability self-assessment tool is there, as I mentioned, vsat.epa.gov. American Water Works is also a fabulous organization to assist with this. There are all kinds of training. There's certificate training programs to someone get certified and all these things. You can see some of their websites on aww.org/risk, aww.org/resilience. There's a great wealth of information on cybersecurity. That's under awwa.org/cybersecurity. DHS has some great information as well, the Homeland Security group. There are some other trade groups. Water ISAC is a commercial trade group that has information. National WARN is also an organization of water and wastewater utilities and networks and how they deal with notifications of events, and of course FEMA.gov. These are all some great websites, a wealth of materials. So, alrighty. So, I thought we'd talk a little bit about emergency response plans. That's a second requirement of AWIA. Once you get your risk and resilience assessment completed, that information will be important for creation or update of your emergency response plan. So some of the things that are included in your emergency response plan is strategies and resources to improve resilience, including upgrades for cyber security, as well as hard security, fences and telemetry and locked doors and facility security. And these are plans for responding to natural disasters or malevolent acts. So not only things that we want to implement now, but how we're going to respond to our disasters and emergency events. All right, some municipalities are very fortunate. They have emergency response plans already in place, and this information you can build on that and update those. I think a lot of municipalities, utilities that I'm familiar with have overall emergency response plans for the municipality as a whole. Not as many have an emergency response plan specifically focused on the water supply and distribution facilities. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. Right, so these can also include actions and equipment to lessen the impacts of malevolent acts or natural hazards. How do we prepare? What can we implement? What can we do now to lessen the impacts? If we have a major storm or major flood or again, a chemical spill, things like that. What can we do now to lessen the impact of that? It talks about strategies to detect malevolent acts or natural hazards. Again, telemetry, cameras. There is information and technology out there now to detect some of the PFAS issues that are appearing now in our drinking water supplies, our groundwater and surface water supplies, and there's technology out there to be able to detect that versus sampling, which is a little bit after the fact. So intermunicipal agreements are important for this type of emergency response plan. You've all heard of agreements between fire departments and mutual aid agreements. Well, same can apply with your emergency response plans for your water facility. Are there interconnections that are available to you to draw water from an adjoining municipality, a neighboring municipality, if for instance, one of your surface water supplies go down or other issues occur? And it also, you want to plan for secure location of plans and records. If we have natural disaster, a fire, a tornado, you don't want everything all wiped out in that case. Our blower just went on and off there. So it also talks about coordination. The EPA is very big on coordination. They specifically talk about coordination with local emergency planning committees when preparing or revising the risk assessment and emergency response plan, as I mentioned before. There are, again, here in Saratoga County is quite an active emergency response group. And they can be at all levels of government, local, county, state, even federal, and private sector partners. EPA also recommends very good maintenance of records. You want to maintain your risk assessment and ERP for 5 years after the due date for certification. And I always like to say these are tremendously dynamic documents and plans. They should never just be done, sit on the shelf, and you pick it up every 5 years. These are active documents that your management of your water utility or community water system should be working with regularly and have it part of discussions, whether it's yearly reviews of operations, develop new standard operating procedures, even monthly or weekly staff meetings. These documents need to be in play and in use. So certification, as I mentioned, once you do these plans, you have to certify that they are completed, both the risk assessment and the emergency response plan. You don't need to actually send it to the EPA. It's a relatively easily certification process that can be done electronically. You only need the name, the date of the plan completion, the statement of completion. And I haven't seen it yet, but I believe the EPA may be providing an optional certification template for the risk assessment. And these, I haven't seen those yet, but maybe imminent. Completing and submitting reports, as I mentioned, there's a great self-assessment tool, the vulnerability self-assessment tool. There's the website again for municipalities that want to take a look at this and do a self-assessment, and you can also submit your risk assessment reports right through that. Emergency response plan templates are available on the EPA website. They really do at Water Resilience have a great emergency response plan template available. I encourage you to go in there and do some research. And if you municipality is thinking about they need to update this, there's some great information once again on the EPA website. And they can be submitted online or via email. Just a note here, I'm sure the EPA loves this, they can assess a penalty of up to $25,000 a day for non-compliance. I'm not aware of them doing that anywhere. I think in my experience with regulators and new regulations, as long as municipality is making an effort, trying to comply, doing something, most agencies are fairly amenable to making sure you're going along and be happy with that. If you're kind of thumbing your nose at them and refusing to do anything, that's when they get their neck hair up and start talking about penalties, whether it's at the EPA or the New York State DEC or other regulators, and that's in my experience. So once again, epa.gov/water resilience is a great resource, lots of information there. All righty, so I just want to talk a little bit about the due dates. Martin touched upon this in his introduction. If the largest community water system serving more than 100,000 people, those risk and resilience assessments were due on March 31st of this year. The emergency response plan certifications are due 6 months after the completion of that. So they were also due this past September, emergency response plans. Then they have a medium-sized utility. Those are due, the risk and resilience assessments are due at the end of this year. And again, the emergency response plans will be due next June, the end of next June, 6 months after that. Most of the municipalities I work with and I'm familiar with are not due yet. Their first risk and resilience assessment or the certifications are due June 30th of 2021. So I would say that if you are a municipality starting to think about this, they do take a while to compile the information and get management approval, town, village board, or city council approval. That takes some time. So June 30th may seem a little while off if you're under 50,000 people served in your water system, but I would encourage you to begin the planning and implementation of that, because it does take a while, especially if you have not done this before, or you don't have a good assessment or risk, asset management plans, or you don't have a good inventory of all your assets. The sooner you begin, later. And so smaller municipalities will be due June 30th with the emergency response plan certification done by the end of next year. Once again, I'll just touch on the 5-year review and revision. So they must review and, if necessary, revise a risk and resilience assessment every 5 years. So there's no free lunch. Once you complete these, you got to look at them every 5 years. And you may submit a certification to the EPA that you have reviewed and, if applicable, revised your risk and resilience assessment. Same thing applies to your emergency response plan. I think the intent here is that these are a dynamic document. Once again, that the community would be constantly updating them based on process improvements, security upgrades, threat assessments, and they would be updated. So when you get near your 5-year period, all you have to do is really submit a certification that, yes, we're current. That's the thinking anyway. I know that's not always possible. So same with the ERP. Every 5 years following the risk assessment, you have to update your ERP, incorporate any revisions, and submit the certification to the EPA. All right, just a note about previous studies. As I mentioned, the Bioterrorism Act required certain size municipalities to complete a vulnerability assessment. And many municipalities have also completed their emergency response plans. You can use those to update to the current regulations. If you don't have those, as I understand, it's very difficult to get them from the EPA. You can request those, but maybe some more significant municipalities completed those and can use them as a basis to update the risk assessments and emergency response plan. That is allowable. You just have to include anything, the assessment response comments listed in the current law, obviously, and reflect the current condition of your water supply. In other words, you can't just resubmit an old vulnerability assessment. You have to make an assessment of what's been changed, what's been updated, and you also have to look at what's required in the regulation, in the new regulations. Yeah, so they may add, you may simply just add some of the updated things and be in pretty good shape. Same with modifications, you may update the risk assessment to certain plant modifications, process modifications, upgrades. We're talking quite a few years ago, so I think a lot of water treatment plants, facilities, whether it's storage tank, distribution systems may very well have considerable updated equipment in our process modifications. So it's okay to use previous information if you have it. All right, so just a note about the EPA is big on this. They don't require any specific standard or tool to develop your risk assessments or your emergency response plans. You're only required to follow the law, so they're fairly flexible on what you use and how you do that. As long as you're in compliance with the law, you can use whatever method or tools or AWA methods, what have you, to develop your risk assessment, your emergency response plan. The municipalities have to make sure that it complies with the AWIA requirements. They can't use other methods, they say, I'm not exactly sure what they mean there, but what other methods, but they're big on alternate methods cannot be used in place of the requirements. EPA spells that out pretty clearly. But I think as long, the big thing, message is if you are in compliance with the AWIA requirements and the law, then you're in good shape. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about ways to improve resiliency here. Just some examples on you know, what the law says basically and what you have to do. Let's look at some examples how we're going to do this. Yeah, so we submitted our risk and resilience assessment, and so we're in good shape. We've identified a lot of problem areas. Well, one of the things that we can increase our resiliency and understand how our system operates is with a hydraulic model. Hydraulic model is basically a model with all your pipes and your storage tanks and your pumping systems in a digital format. And that allows you to understand where the fire flow, where the pressures are, where your water's going, the size of pipes. And by creating a digital twin, which is just a side-by-side model, there's the static model, the operating model, you can create a digital twin where you can change things and you can model different types of scenarios. Oh, what happens if we increase pipe size? What happens if we take a water tank out of service? What happens? We're having fire flow problems in this area. What happens if we increase the pipe size or do a project? What happens if we have broken pipe in this area? What will that do with our fire flow and our pressure? You can model emergency responses and plan accordingly. What happens if we have a big fire here? We need to have fire flow in all these areas. What's going to happen in other areas? We're going to have enough pressure to fill our tank in a certain area. We're going to have enough pressure to even supply water to houses when different things happen. This will help us keep our asset management plans updated when we model things like that. Again, kind of a digital twin is a hydraulic model that allows us to simulate events against a pipe failure or power outages where our pumps aren't working, fires and contamination. You can use these models to identify previously obscure risks that we didn't really think about. We can determine ways to build in resilience and provide more precise data for emergency plans. We can incorporate the model into our control room operations. An operator can simulate an action before making any operational changes. Maybe we'd want to take a tank offline for cleaning, a water storage tank, or maintenance. Well, we want to simulate that event. If we're not getting pressure from that storage tank, what happens then? So we can simulate pipe breaks. What happens if we're losing flow? We have a major break, a 12-inch main. What is that? What areas of the distribution system does that put in risk? And we can model, like I said, replacement piping and determine critical locations, pipe sizes, major breaks, how we're going to move the water around. We may be able to go out and shut some valves to move water around disrupted areas. Again, we can simulate power outages, impacts of standby power generation, things like that. So as far as risk and resiliency planning, this really, a water model can really help, and it can show us when and where we need emergency connections to neighboring systems we mentioned before. That's part of our resilience planning. What's our backup plan? We don't want all our eggs in one basket. We have some eggs in that other basket. We can plan for things, and it's a really integral part of our risk and resilience assessments, and as well as our emergency response plans. All right, fires can be simulated, kind of touched on that. If we don't have enough elevated storage, we can see how long we have until that tank drains. We can sense contamination, what we're going to do about it. If we all of a sudden in our surface intakes, we get some water that is not acceptable or testing standards, or if there is some other kind of contamination in an area of the system for whatever reason, we can simulate what happens with how far those contaminants and how quick they move through the system. It'd be great information for operators to have. All right, so this is just some examples how water models can make us more resistant. Without a model, well, if we're going to shut down this area, what happens to the pressure drop south side of town? We don't really know. Well, the model, we know what the pressure drop will be. Okay, and the hill will drop from 42 to 23 psi, and the south side tank will drain by 7:40 p.m. if we don't get things turned back on. Again, we can look at fire flow modeling. All right, we know that if we're going to get this number 3 pump on, the fire flow will increase to fight this fire. All righty, so we come to our conclusions. The AWIA requirements can help your water utility become more resilient by planning for malevolent acts and natural hazards. Large amount, if not all, the required assessment and planning work can be done in-house with existing staff and resources. Again, there's a lot of information available online to assist municipalities with this. It can be a long process to gather data and complete these plans. I guess the message here is don't wait. If you haven't done it and you are required to do it, your small and medium-sized community water systems should begin the process as soon as possible to meet the 2020 and 2020 deadlines. And utilize water models or other asset management software and other available tools to keep on top of the water system changes and regulatory updates, and keep your plans, your emergency response plans, even your risk and resiliency assessments as dynamic documents, and keep them updated as best you can. So that ends my presentation. Thanks for getting through all that with me.
Sure. Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate your sharing your expertise with us. I think we're really diving into the nuts and bolts of how water systems operate and how additional requirements are being placed on operators of these complex systems. Let's see. I'm trying to get to a question here. Let's see. It's going to take me a second to digest it. There's a lot of text here. Let's see. So the question is, how does this fit in with protecting the public from the infrastructure in cases of elevated lead levels or other contaminants that are potential issues that are occurring right now? And does resilience and risk just apply to infrastructure and not population it serves? So, and I'll just glom onto that. Some of the other concerns we've been seeing or requirements that have been placed on wastewater or water system operators are related to documenting and testing PFOA and PFOS. And those, do human health impacts find their way into these two types of assessments that you're talking about?
Yeah, the PFAS and related compounds are what's called an emerging contaminant. Obviously, there's new regulations. So New York State DEC, AWA, there's probably a lot of documentation on that. That is definitely a risk and resilience assessment item to be concerned about. And I think that, you know, it's important for operators to understand the emerging contaminant regulations and how we're going to address those. And certainly, as I mentioned, water models can predict that. There are remote sensing technology out there that are developed to sense these things when they get into not only the pipes, but the water stream. I think the question is also about lead. Lead is a little bit of a different animal that's more of a, most water systems don't actually have lead at the source. I know in Saratoga Springs we don't, but they can be problematic for older homes, a certain era with lead solder, lead pipes, and lead laterals. In the city, we didn't have any problems with lead laterals. They're mostly galvanized, but in the home, if water sits a long time. So I'm not sure that's a good question on that. I'm not, you know, I haven't seen that in the literature and what we've been looking at for the risk and resiliency planning. That's more of a statute to be in compliance with the lead and copper rule. That's more of a regulatory statute that operations has to deal with. Certainly as part of the risk and resilient thinking, if you have something that's going to impact your operations and you can plan to mitigate it other than simply increasing orthophosphate addition or other process changes, I think, but the PFAS type compounds are definitely part of the risk and resilience assessment and any of the other emerging compounds now that regulations are being identified for. Certainly, they're going to necessitate process changes at water facilities. They're going to have to spend capital money on that. How they're going to implement that. There may be standard operating procedures implemented for that. It's not necessarily a malevolent act or a natural disaster, but it is something that many municipalities will be facing because these things are in our water system at the parts per billion level. And how to be able to evaluate and plan for that is certainly important.
Thanks. I had another question about how these plans integrate local and municipal planners. Is their input critical to a successful or a complete resiliency and risk plan? And from your experience putting these together, are there gaps that municipal planners could be able to fill or provide resources to completing these risk and resiliency plans?
Yeah, I think municipal planners are a very integral part of these things. There's different types of water utilities out there. I can, you know, in my experience in the city of Saratoga Springs, the city and the public works are responsible for water supply, and the city public works engineering department is also responsible for review of site development plans and work with the city planners directly on that. Whenever we had a subdivision or a plan development, you know, the analysis of being able to water supply, water quality, we're very much in lockstep with the review of planning board operations. All right, so that's a municipality that is integrated like that. I think the planning departments have an essential role in making sure that, you know, planning departments are looking at, you know, the land use regulations and, you know, subdivision regulations, the stormwater regulations, but also as part of that, if you have a big subdivision, how are you going to supply? If you have enough water, do you have the fire flow and pressure to supply that, or do you need to make the developers make improvements, whether it's process improvements, whether it's a booster station, whether it's new infrastructure? Same is true for wastewater, obviously. Other municipalities have a completely separate water company, like a community water service. You know,
The city of Albany has an authority, for example.
Right, so it's an authority. So I'm not as familiar with that, but certainly as the EPA recommends, coordination with state, local, county emergency planning. The planners for the city of Albany don't have direct, communication with that, but as part of the overall emergency planning for the city, I would think they'd be crucial to that process. These are plans that are developed. These are not, just design of technology that just the engineers can do. I think the discussion of risk and resiliency, emergency planning, municipal planning staffs, I think are integral with that. And again, here in the city of Saratoga Springs, the planning department was very much involved with the engineering department in review of any land use board applications.
In your experience with the city, did they own or maintain any water supplies that were outside the boundaries of the municipality, and how was coordination handled with municipalities that surrounded those water bodies? So when it came time for either a subdivision regulation or a site plan review, how was the city involved in review of those applications?
Yeah, that's great. So in the city, I can speak to the city engineer's office, and the city planning would review applications that are within the city of Saratoga Springs. And so I know the city did not have any water resources outside the city limits. We didn't have any source capacity, storage, or groundwater supply. They were all within the city. However, when it comes to emergency planning, there's the Saratoga County Water Authority had some big transmission lines that went south on the west side of the city, and it was before my time, but I know that there was discussion of connecting to the Saratoga County Water Authority for either a partial supply of water, emergency supply. That was before my time. Discussions didn't end up doing that. However, the previous city engineer had the County Water Authority put in 5 Ts along that county water line, so an emergency, maybe a quick connection could be made. So I think for emergency basis, emergency planning, it's always good to coordinate with other utilities. I know the governor's office for small cities quite a few years ago gave out shared municipal services grants. A lot of communities were evaluating their water systems along with their neighbors and see if they could combine water systems. I know the city of Mechanicville, the town of Village of Stillwater did that, as well as several communities, I think up in Lake Champlain area, Rouse's Point, Village and Town of Champlain. So my personal experience is we didn't have to deal with adjoining municipalities for water. We would sell water. Municipalities often sell water outside their boundaries, and the city does that. So I'm not sure exactly, if that answered your question, but coordination with both the municipal neighbors and the county emergency planning, local, state level emergency planning, I think for these plans, that kind of coordination is very good.
Okay. Just a reminder, if folks do have additional questions, scramble, get them into the chat so we can address those before we wrap up. It doesn't seem like we're getting any more, so I think you've been very comprehensive in your review of these plans and techniques to put them together. I see you have your contact information on the screen, so if folks do want to reach out to you, they can do that. Again, we'll have links to this archive presentation in video format on the Eventbrite page where people signed up for the webinar. So please look for that. It takes about a day or two to process the video and post it to our YouTube account. So if you did miss something or you want to come back and review something or get Tim's contact information, you certainly have that from the video archive. I do want to thank you again for being available to us and sharing your expertise, and also thank you for underwriting this webinar to keep it affordable for folks that from their municipalities that want to dial in. We did have a nominal cost for the webinar series, and that's due in large part because we had sponsorships to be able to keep the cost down to producing the webinars and delivering them. So I do want to thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. With that, it is 4 o'clock and I'll close things up, and I want to thank folks for attending and Tim for presenting to us, and we hope to see everybody next week for our next webinar. Take care.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.